they're still ignoring the role of the financial sector, which actually causes the bubbles that they think the system might need to stay at a booming rate. And intriguingly, when Krugman talked about that as a solution, he said, so long as the bubbles don't store up problems for the future. But from our analysis, myself and Dirk's, the rising level of debt is what causes the bubbles in the first place. So it's not a solution in that sense. And secular stagnation has certainly occurred because America has been deindustrialising for about 30 years, 40 years or more, transferring production offshore, which is something progressive economists were criticising a long time ago, saying that's where the decline in America came from. But that issue is not being taken seriously by people who are pushing secular stagnation right now. So there has been a huge push of production offshore. And as I said, they used to talk about being anti-protection because under protection in the 1930s, economists claimed people practiced what they call beggar thy neighbour policies. Well, I think what's actually been happening in the last 40 years is beggar thy working class instead. Move production offshore, sack your workers who get paid high wages, hire workers in the third world who get paid low wages, and you get an increase in profit for the wealthy back in the West, but of course a decline in aggregate demand. And that's been going on for 30 or 40 years. They've been ignoring it. As for the inflationary expectations argument, even Krugman, who satirises what he calls the expectations fairy, still comes down and says maybe economists can make people expect inflation in the future, and therefore because they expect inflation, they'll put at their prices, they'll demand higher wages, and you'll get inflation because they expect inflation. I think the whole thing is a fairy tale, quite completely. Inflation is normally a cost-driven event. It's changes in income distribution that give workers more power, which they're not going to get. It's changes in the cost of raw materials, which does happen, feeding through the system. So the very idea that a central bank can set a target for inflationary expectations and hit it, I think is a complete fantasy. And they're going to waste a lot of our time trying to do that, as the Japanese have done for the last 25 years. They've been trying to make people expect inflation. And what's been happening? Halfway between inflation and deflation most of the time. And whether we need bubbles, that's actually a more complex question than it might appear. We certainly don't need bubbles financed by rising debt, financing asset speculation, because that does shore up problems for the future with another crash. But capitalism is based on people chasing potential gains. And some very good work by people who work on what is actually entrepreneurial behaviour, people like Bill Janeway and Maria Mazzucato, saying that the belief you're going to get an enormous gain, and therefore the willingness to risk a large amount of money to do it and to go into debt to do it, can actually end up with those individual people losing money on a large scale, but that's where a large part of the growth of capitalism comes from and the innovation comes from. So we do need that bubble mentality. We just need to get it directed as much as possible towards the industrial side of capitalism and not towards the financial side.